Good afternoon or evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Clean Air, Healthy Kids and Communities, the Case for Strong Methane Regulations. My name is Claire Kraatz, and I'm a co-founder of For Our Kids Alberta and a clean air advocate. I am also the mom of two wonderful teens, and they are the inspiration for the work that I do. Before I introduce our partners, I would like to take a moment for a land acknowledgement. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and share where you are joining us from. I respectfully acknowledge that I am located on Treaty 7 territory, the traveling route, gathering place, and meeting grounds for Indigenous peoples whose histories, language, and traditions continue to influence our communities. I'm grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders, those with us today, and those who have gone before us. I also acknowledge the ongoing exploitation of Indigenous lands for profit and the impact this continues to have on community health and well-being. I see land acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation, and my climate justice work honors those whose territory I live on. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors today. For Our Kids is a parent-led network of volunteers across the country taking meaningful climate action for our kids, grandkids, and future generations. We're united by our concern for our children's future and driven to reduce the impacts of climate change. In short, we want to protect what we love. The Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, or CAPE, unites health professionals and science to confront environmental and health injustices, driving systemic change through stronger policies and public awareness, whether that's addressing plastic pollution or methane emissions. And the Canadian Lung Association works to improve lung health for all Canadians through education, research, and advocacy. They ensure that policymakers have the information and expertise they need to make decisions that protect public health. As a parent, this work is personal. I live in Calgary, and over the past decade, I've experienced how smoke-filled skies and worsening air quality affect our children, keeping them indoors, canceling sports events, and impacting their health and their well-being. In 2024, I presented a Clean Air in Schools policy at the Alberta School Councils Association AGM. It's a policy aimed at improving indoor air quality for health and learning. A few months later, I was connected with Ari Pottens, Senior Campaign Manager with the Environmental Defence Fund, who wanted to learn more about our clean air work. That's when I started learning about methane. This invisible gas that's over 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over the short term. It is released into the atmosphere during oil and gas exploration and production. I felt compelled to learn more and do more about this wicked problem. Since then, For Our Kids has joined national advocacy efforts. Last fall at COP29 in Azerbaijan, we presented a letter to then Minister Stephen Guilbeault, signed by over 500 Canadians, calling on the government to pass bold methane regulations. Fast forward to today, we have a new government, and we are still waiting for the regulations to pass. We also have a new letter for Canadians to sign that we will put in the chat. And we have the support of 31 ally organizations, including Seniors for Climate Action Now, Teachers for Future Turtle Island, and the Council of Canadians. We have an opportunity to make a difference, and that's why we're here today. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat, and we will do our best to get to some of them. And whatever we're not able to answer in this session, we'll be sure to send a follow-up email with our responses and then a link to the recording. And now I would like to introduce our outstanding panel of experts, and I'm very grateful to all of them for being here today and to share their knowledge and their insights. Tim Doty is president of TCHD Consulting, LLC in Driftwood, Texas, although he's joining us from New Mexico today. Hi, Tim. He provides environmental safety and thermography consulting across North and South America and Europe. He is an ITC certified level 3 master thermographer with expertise in optimal gas imaging. It's been featured by outlets like the Associated Press, PBS NewsHour, the BBC, and the New York Times. Tim retired in 2018 after more than 30 years with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, where he specialized in environmental monitoring and compliance. Dr. Joe Vipond is an emergency physician who has witnessed the health impacts of the climate crisis firsthand. He helped lead the successful campaign to phase out coal-fired power in Alberta and has served as past president of CAPE and is the co-founder of the Calgary Climate Hub. During COVID-19, Dr. Vipond co-founded Masks for Canada, Protect Our Province, Alberta, and the Canadian COVID Society, promoting evidence-based public health policies. He's also a clinical assistant professor at the University of Calgary and a scientific advisor with the World Health Network. Aaron Freeman is the managing partner of PivotStrategic, where he advances environmental solutions and Indigenous reconciliation through public policy. For more than 3 decades, he has led major advocacy campaigns and worked closely with parliamentarians on key legislative and regulatory initiatives. He is the founder and past president of GreenPAC, which builds environmental leadership in politics, and he created Canada's Parliamentary Internship for the Environment and the 100 Debates for the Environment Initiative. Aaron is also a former senior advisor to the Premier of Ontario and has been recognized by the Hill Times as one of Canada's top 100 federal lobbyists. But we'll begin with Ari Pottens, a dad who is also concerned about the world we're leaving for our kids, and a senior campaign manager with the Environmental Defense Fund. Ari works with civil society partners and policymakers across North America to reduce oil and gas methane emissions and has been deeply involved in strengthening Canada's regulations. He'll start us off with the science behind methane. So over to you, Ari.
Thanks very much, Claire. I'm just going to share my screen real quick and get started. Okay, Claire, thank you so much. Thank you to the other organizing organizations and for everybody for spending your time with us this evening. I'll be briefly presenting on methane, what it is, why it matters, how our scientists are going about trying to measure it today, and what we can do about it. I'll try to be relatively quick so that you guys can hear from all the other excellent panelists. And just to say that I'm here on behalf of EDF methane scientist Scott Seymour, who is far more technical than I, and who is the brains behind many of the cool charts and graphs that you'll see within. And I'll do my best to answer questions. Okay, so let's see. Here we are. So what is methane and why does it matter? Claire discussed it as a potent greenhouse gas, over 80 times more so than carbon dioxide. It's currently responsible for 30% of global warming today. It also only exists in the atmosphere for approximately a decade, which makes it such an opportune issue to work on, because if we reduce those emissions now, we can actually slow warming in the short term. And it's also the main component of natural gas, which means that when it leaks or when it is vented, we are losing a valuable economic commodity that many of us use to heat our own homes or that can be sold overseas. The UN says reducing human caused methane emissions is one of the most cost-effective strategies to rapidly reduce the rate of warming. So where does methane come from in Canada? Well, it mostly comes from the oil and gas sector, from ag and from waste. For our purposes, we've been mainly dealing with the oil and gas sector. And that's because it presents amongst the cheapest and fastest ways to reduce emissions from that sector of the economy. So when methane is released, either intentionally or unintentionally through fugitives, intentionally through venting, flaring, it comes with it are co-pollutants, VOCs like benzene, other VOCs, PM 2.5, hydrogen sulfide, things that cause issues for people's health, lead to issues like asthma, and depending on your proximity to different sites, other more insidious health challenges. And now this is the phase where it gets a little bit more technical and where I'll be relaying more of Scott's research, thinking about how methane is measured. Well, historically, it's been really difficult to measure those emissions. A lot of it was based on models and estimates, and models and estimates. But more recently, we've been able to directly measure emissions, and scientists like Scott were able to determine that they're a lot higher than governments have been thinking and then industry have been reporting. So if I'm just thinking about a couple of these graphics that you're seeing here, the one in the bottom indicates that the government's inventory of a specific region of Canada's emissions was actually 2.8 times lower than what Scott was able to find in 2023. And that is the CHOPS region along the Saskatchewan-Alberta border. If we were to look at the graphic on the top right, we can see that Professor Matt Johnson, who's out of Carleton University in Ottawa, found that, excuse me, I have something blocking the screen. There we are. Found that the national inventory, Canada's federal sort of inventory count of our emissions, found that methane was underreported by 1.7 times. So moving on, the federal inventory, the folks at Environment and Climate Change Canada actually worked with Professor Johnson to commission flyovers of oil and gas sites, have him kind of analyze the data and determine more accurately how many methane emissions there are in Canada. And the result of that research was that the inventory was adjusted by 30%. So we were 30% off before 2024. And this is something that is like a world first. It's a way in which Canada is demonstrating leadership and really a good news story about our understanding about how many emissions there are. The challenge for us is how to solve that problem, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And I know Aaron's going to talk about that in his presentation when he discusses the regulations. I think I'll just skip over this one in the interest of time, but suffice to say, I will skip over it and skip over it. This is a slide that Scott, sort of illustrative of a recent paper that Scott did, looking at something called surface casing vent flow. And I think the key takeaway here is just that there are a lot of emission sources within the oil and gas supply chain that we really have a poor understanding of. So if we're looking at the chart on the left there, we can see that in 2023, the provincial government of Alberta, believed that there was somewhere in the range of 42 kilotons of methane emissions from this one type of emission source, this surface casing vent flow. In 2024, they thought there was over 62 kilotons. And then the federal government in the same year thought there was only 42. And the point is just that there's a ton of disagreement between governments, between entities within governments about how many emissions there are from this one source. And this one source could potentially represent 2% of emissions or 11%, which is a huge chunk of the pie. So until we have a better understanding of where our emissions come from, it's going to be a lot harder to cut back on those emissions. Nevertheless, we are moving in that direction, cutting back on emissions. And again, I'm skipping forward a little bit, can keep it focused on what we can do. We're thinking about regulations in 2023, December 2023, the government put forward proposed regulations to reduce their emissions by 75%, produce Canadian methane emissions by 75% by 2030. EDF, CAPE for Our Kids, the Suzuki Foundation, Pembina Institute, Canada Lung Association, all of their coalition kind of member organizations written in support of this effort. Investors have written in support of this effort. There's a methane mitigation industry that has popped up to help oil and gas companies reduce their emissions. Some of whom are also supportive of this. So there's a lot of strong voices behind passing these regulations, not only because it's good for the climate, because it's good for health, but it's also good for the economy in many respects. And I suspect you'll hear more about that from Aaron when he speaks, and most likely from our other panelists as well. And I believe that brings me to the end of my time, but I appreciate again deeply all of your time today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing if there are any questions.
So hello out there. So my name is Tim Doty, and I'm here to talk to you. I'm like we talked about a minute ago. I'm in the United States in the state of New Mexico near Santa Fe, but I'm here to talk to you about a Canadian optical gas imaging assessment that was conducted this summer between June 18th or June 8th through 14th, 2025 in both Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so, the first part of this, before I get into, my individual slides, I want to just mention that the field work that we're going to talk about today was commissioned by the David Suzuki Foundation in collaboration with the Environmental Defense Fund. So we really appreciate that. And then some extra technical assistance and OGI camera was provided by Oilfield Witness out of the state of Texas. So just, I don't want to go geek y'all out and go way technical on you, but just to kind of give you a basic understanding. So optical gas imaging, or better known as OGI, has existed in a handheld technology since about 2005. So we're obviously 20 years into it. And I know that because I started using OGI cameras with the state of Texas when I worked for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and led their ambient air monitoring team again in 2005. And I used camera number 9 off the assembly line. And so still today, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, considers OGI to be the best system for emission reduction for the oil and gas industry in the United States. So this technology, OGI, is extensively described and discussed in U.S. federal government environmental regulations that would, not your world probably, but especially in the leak detection and repair, method 21 and the U.S. Federal regulations nomenclature, potentially really looking for fugitive emission leaks. And so, these regulations have been put into place for the last, 10 or 15 years, and are all, all encompassing of various methane sources in the United States. And then OGI in general is used to identify both permitted and unpermitted emissions in the regulatory world. That includes leaks, safety and maintenance issues, and unexpected emission sources. So it's obviously used a lot for fugitive emission leaks to identify it, but plenty of other sources, associated with safety and emissions, etc. Next. Okay, just from the basic sense, OGIs allow a trained user to detect and visualize thermal radiation. Okay, so it's energy that exists on Earth that you cannot see with the bare eye, but the camera can detect it because it has a special filter. And there are different camera types out there, and I don't want to go way into that for y'all. But the cameras that were in particular that was used on this monitoring project this summer, which was a follow-up to a previous trip that was conducted in the summer of 2022, was the Teledyne FLIR G620 camera that had a special filter in it that looks for infrared energy between about 3.2 and 3.4 micrometers in the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay. And you don't really have to understand it completely, but just the electromagnetic spectrum describes basically energy that moves on Earth, from shorter waves to longer waves that again, you can't see with the bare eye. In the electromagnetic spectrum, you can see visible light, but infrared energy lies between visible light and microwaves, right? I mean, people generally use microwaves, and you have this magic box and you turn it on and you program it for a time and a temperature and you cook your food. And that's because you're bombarding it with energy, and the food item is soaking up that energy. Well, in essence, infrared energy, it's just another form of energy, again, that you can't see with the bare eye, but the camera can see it. And then to be successful, to be able to see gas detection, you have to have the right ambient conditions. And so we obviously need a camera that has a filter in there that's appropriate for the chemical that we're trying to detect, or the hydrocarbon we're trying to detect. And in this case, we can see a lot of different hydrocarbon chemicals, but primarily, as Ari already described, methane is the primary component in natural gas. And there needs to be plume movement. And then you need a temperature difference between the plume of methane and whatever the background source is, whether it's the atmosphere or the sidewall of a storage tank, etc. And you're really, although it can see smaller increments, you're really trying to get either a 2 degrees C or a 3.6 degrees F temperature difference or greater to be able to detect the gas. Okay, next. Okay, so in this first video, I'm in Alberta, and we're looking at storage tank and combustor emissions. And you're gonna have to yeah, there you go. And this is what it looked like to the bare eye at different vantage points. And you're looking at the top of the storage tank, of which you'll see the word methane go up there. So we're looking at continuous methane emissions being released from the top of that storage tank. And now as I pan the camera to the right, we're looking at uncombusted, partially combusted hydrocarbon. Right? You can't see that with the bare eye. It is definitely heated emissions when it's released. Right here, we're looking at an unidentified ground level methane emission source within the facility. Again, you can't see, or I couldn't see the emissions with the bare eye, but it's detectable because the camera has that filter in there. We have more emissions coming out the top of the storage tank. You can see that. And that graphic scale on the right shows you the temperature. In this case, it was Celsius. I believe I had it programmed here to look to see that the emissions coming out the top of the emission sources are unheated. And you can kind of match up the colors, right? This is a rainbow high contrast palette. And you can see when it turns, a light purple color, it's basically just ambient temperature. And so everything you see is methane or air pollution, again, that you cannot see with your bare eye, but the camera can detect it. So the question is whether those control devices are operating as designed, and whether those emissions are permitted or not. Okay, next. Okay, so here we're looking at a different time facility. I'm near Kindersley, so I'm over in Saskatchewan. And this is storage tanks. And you can see in a rainbow high contrast palette and a colorized palette, all those emissions coming out both the front storage tank and the rear storage tank it's non-heated sources. So that's uncombusted methane that's being released into the atmosphere. And as you see, as I pan the camera, because we try to go from origin to end, how far that emission plume actually extends from the emission sources. And again, you can see from looking at that graphic scale, span temperature scale on the right side, that those are unheated emission, right? This is not what you want to see. Again, you're not seeing it with the bare eye, but this is all contributing to climate change and potential, depending on the circumstances, public exposure to these different compounds that are within these emissions. Okay, now we're looking at another site near Kindersley. And this is not uncommon in Canada. And I got to tell you, what I see is not completely outside the norm of what I see in the Permian Basin in Texas and New Mexico. This is an unlit flare. So this is a flare, this is a combustion control device that's designed to combust emissions from an oil and gas site. And depending on the type of flare, it should combust in somewhere in between about the 98 to 95% range. All right, but this is not what you would expect. The flare here is completely unlit, and instead of having combustion going on, this is completely uncombusted hydrocarbon. And you're able to clearly see that black plume because it's a completely different temperature than what the background is. All right, this is not what you want to see at all. This would be unpermitted. All right, this is not what flares are. That's not the way they're designed to operate. Now we're looking at another facility over in Saskatchewan. And you can see this is going to be collected in rainbow high contrast. And you can see the arrow that points to the origin of the methane emissions. But if you look at the storage tanks, you can see the movement of the plumes back behind the storage tanks and also along the tank walls. And this is high velocity, meaning there was a lot of pressure involved here with these emissions. And all that movement, all that color movement on those storage tanks is the gas being emitted from the pipe to the right, and it's moving across the front wall of those storage tanks. And the camera detects not only the gas, but a temperature difference. And the reason the storage tank, these are unheated emission, but the reason the storage tank is colorized on this side, and you see those red, and it's a hotter temperature, the sun was facing into these storage tanks. And so there's radiation shining off the sun down on the sidewall of the storage tanks, and the storage tanks are heating up. And as the storage tanks are heating up, it makes it more easy to visually detect the emissions, primarily methane emissions, with this technology. Again, not stuff that you want to see, right? Those are, I think, I went back to the same facility in 2022, saw the same things from 3 years ago, right? These are not unusual emissions. These are not the exceptions to the rule. These are what you see in the field. This is a smaller facility over near Vermilion, Alberta, and there's a resident that lives nearby here, and there's 2 of these batteries. And this is pretty common in Canada too. You have compressors at the sites to increase pressure to draw up energy out of the ground, of which you would normally expect to see some uncombusted hydrocarbon. That wouldn't be unusual. But in this case, on these sheds that you have in Canada, a lot of them have like external vents, sometimes internal, but external vents. And in this case, it's just external pressure at the site that this company is not, storing the gas inside the storage tanks, and they don't have a flare on site to combust the gas. So they just put out a vent line somewhere, in this case, on the side of this shed, and they're just openly venting methane. All right, this is pretty common, especially up near kind of the Lloydminster area, both on the Saskatchewan and Alberta side. So anyway, that's just, I went to a lot of different facilities. It took a lot of different videos. This is just kind of a small sample of what we detected this summer, again, in June. up in both the Alberta and Saskatchewan side. And these are the kind of emissions that we're, trying to prevent and minimize through, regulation and also, less drilling and alternative energy sources. So thank you for your time.
All right, I think I'm up next, and I'm going to be talking about the health impacts of flaring and venting. And so I'm going to start off with the good news. The good news is that methane actually isn't toxic. If you inhale methane, it doesn't seem to have much of an impact on your respiratory system, your cardiovascular system. It's not a carcinogen that we know of. What it is what we call an asphyxiant. So what does that mean? It just means that if it fills a space and replaces the oxygen in there, you can't breathe it. So you'll just basically die from asphyxiation. Not really a big deal on the prairies of Alberta or Saskatchewan. Be a big deal, like say if your gas stove the pipe broke and leaked uninhibited methane into your space, and also don't light a match while you're at it. But that would be the situation where that asphyxiation would be an issue. Now, we've already talked a little bit about the two ways that this is an issue, both with venting and then with flaring. So that's the last of the good news, that you're not going to get intoxicated by methane. Now it gets less fun. So let's talk about them separately. Venting, as we've already talked about and shown, it's really from pneumatic devices and compressors, and these fugitive emissions, either from active production and sometimes even from the old abandoned wells. So the problem with the venting is that the gases that come from these facilities aren't purified. So anything that is volatile is a gas, and methane is that simple CH4 chemical, but there's lots of other things that are volatile as well. And some of them are pretty toxic. The ones that we think of are called volatile organic compounds. Volatile means, is in a gaseous form. Organic usually means it has a carbon basis to it, and compounds just means that they're not simple. So the ones that we often think of are things like benzene and toluene, and they're pretty bad chemicals. They are directly related to they're known carcinogens and directly related to an impact on health. The other one that's not a VOC is H2S, hydrogen sulfide. Very toxic gas, and if it does get inhaled, it can kill you pretty quickly. All of these chemicals are associated with premature death, chronic and short-term respiratory and cardiac health. So if we turn to flaring, so the difference between venting is the gas just goes out in the atmosphere. Flaring, we actually light it on fire. So flaring is better for the climate because, as we've already talked about, methane is 82 times the impact of CO2. And so by converting it from methane to CO2, you are decreasing the climate impact of that individual chemical. The problem is, again, you're burning things. And whenever you burn things, you produce smoke, you produce toxins. The ones that often come to mind are NOx and SOx. Those are nitrogen oxide compounds and sulfur oxide compounds. They have a direct impact on respiratory health. They're the things that produce ozone that can also be respiratory irritants. And then again, those VOCs, those volatile organic compounds, because the combustion doesn't completely combust things to CO2 and water. There's other chemicals that are released into the atmosphere. And then PM 2.5. And I want to highlight PM 2.5 because in the history of air pollution, those are the ones that are most associated with health impacts, from a wide variety of health impacts, all the way from premature births to cancers to premature deaths. So they're a big deal. I just want to highlight one thing that we haven't really talked about, that, and I think this is really shocking, but we actually had a limit on flaring in our province up until June of this year. The limit was a maximum of 670 million cubic meters. That still seems like a lot, but we started exceeding that in 2023, and then even more so in 2024. So in 2024, it was 912 million cubic meters versus the limit of 670 million cubic meters. And the Alberta Energy Regulator said, well, that was because we had increased production. And what do you do? Like, what do you do? More production means more flaring, means more pollution. So they scrapped it. So we actually have no limit on flaring now within our province. A January 2025 study looking at health impacts of the oil and gas industry generally, not just on flaring and venting, and other studies in the United States have pointed out that the impacts on the health are predominantly to rural communities, and that includes in Alberta the Indigenous communities that live rurally. But I also want to point out that that's not exclusively so. My wife not that long ago sent me a photo of a flare in the middle of Calgary in the community of Inglewood. Burning away, massive flame. So really, no one is safe. And there were some studies out of the United States, out of the Bakken, that looked at the health impacts, and they could see an impact on communities 60 miles. So about 100 kilometers downwind of flaring stacks. And so again, looking at those flaring health impacts, the things that you can expect directly that have been directly related to flaring, not just in the chemicals, but directly related to flaring, is asthma exacerbations, premature births, hospitalizations, and even early mortality. Finally, I just want to make a spiel for the fact that climate change, the climate crisis in and of itself, has a multitude of health impacts. That's a whole other webinar in and of itself. But because methane is such a horribly powerful greenhouse gas, the amount of limitation that we can put on there it will be like an emergency brake on our climate crisis. And I think the generally accepted rule is less than 0.2% of any methane in the system being leaked through fugitive or intentional leaks. And everything that I've read said that we're well above that, in particular in Alberta and British Columbia. And so I will hand it back to the MC. Sorry, no slides, Maria. You just have to imagine.
Howdy, folks. It's Aaron Freeman. I'm based in Toronto, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the opportunities to make a difference on Canadian policy is in the area of methane. We can go to the next slide. So the goal of the campaign, and as Ari and Claire have mentioned, the campaign sort of groups together the main organizations that are involved in federal advocacy around methane. Then we've all kind of agreed that we need the top priority and the most immediate priority right now is to get this final regulation passed. So we have an existing regulation for 2025. This is a new, stronger regulation that will get us further to a 75% reduction target by 2030. We also want to push for a near zero target for 2030 or 2035. That's both of those sound very ambitious, and they are, but they are also in line with where industry has said it wants to go globally. There's an agreement globally that has set near zero as a voluntary target for industry, but that's signed off on by oil and gas companies that represent about 40%, over 40% of global production of oil and gas. So there is some, even industry is kind of giving a nod at least on a voluntary basis that they're on board with this. And the province of British Columbia has also set near zero as their target by 2035. So we think that's a reasonable, ambitious, but very reasonable target for the federal government to set for Canada. Just going back to the 2030 reg, so that would get us to 75%. The current regulation, which reduces methane by 40%, is coming up this year, and the question is, what's next? That regulation is implemented through what are called equivalency agreements with the key oil and gas producing provinces. So BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, they each have regulations, provincial regulations, and if they're deemed equivalent by the federal government to the federal regulation, then the provincial regulation is what holds. That regulation in BC is fairly strong. We're reasonably confident that it will achieve its target. Alberta has some weaknesses in its regulation, and Saskatchewan has a lot of weaknesses in its regulation. But that is, welcome to the Federation. That's the way Canada works in lots of areas of environmental jurisdiction. And that is likely the way that the methane regulation will continue to operate if the 2030 regulation is passed. So we do have some provincial buy-in to the 75% target. It aligns with even the Alberta UCP has set that as an aspirational target, aligning that level of ambition with where the federal government wants to go. And BC has actually gone so far as to pass a draft regulation, which they'll seek equivalency on. And they've also, as I mentioned, committed to a near zero target by 2035. Go to the next one. So, as we all know, there's certainly been some backsliding on climate policy under the new government. And we've seen that in areas like the most obvious, which is the climb down, the removal of the consumer carbon price. We're also seeing signals that they may weaken or eliminate the emissions cap on the oil and gas sector. They've put a hold on the EV the electric vehicle mandate. That said, there are positive. Methane is one area where we're not actually seeing any kind of strong indications that the federal government is going to back down. Touching wood on that, but we're hoping that that methane at least is not among the things where that backsliding that we've seen will happen. And there's other indications too. I mean, industry is opposed to the methane regulation, but not to the level that they're opposed to other climate measures. These emissions are very, very cheap. We've actually modeled those emissions and the costs associated with reducing methane. They're pretty much, without going into the technical details, happy to provide you with those studies, but it's the cheapest thing going in the oil and gas sector. If the oil and gas sector isn't doing methane, they're really not doing anything meaningful, more than likely, because these are the cheapest emissions that they can achieve. Much cheaper than the carbon price, much cheaper than any other significant measure that they could do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we are expecting a decision on the federal regulation fairly soon. It was supposed to be in the climate competitiveness strategy that the federal government has floated. A week or two ago, they said that would be coming out before the end of October. They're now saying that it will come out in the budget on November 4th. I would see that as a slightly negative signal. It kind of looks like they're burying, that they're probably not able to land a lot of the decisions that they need to land in that strategy. So they're kind of burying it in the budget, which is not a great sign overall for climate, I don't think. And it might be that I'm just doing the inside baseball thing and and looking a little bit too deeply into this. But it is, well, we will know very soon whether the government is serious about reducing methane. We'll know that in about 10 days. So the key decision makers on this are the Prime Minister and the Natural Resources Minister, Tim Hodgson. Tim Hodgson doesn't actually have this file. It's actually at Environment and Climate Change Canada, Minister DeBruyson's department. But if in this government, if the Natural Resources Minister is standing in the way of this, that's probably the most serious threat to the regulation. We have heard that Natural Resources is kind of, we've gotten them to neutral on this file, that they're not standing in the way. But again, the proof will be in the pudding, and that's the pudding will be in the flavor of a federal budget. In terms of what we're likely to see, I mean, we'll certainly see some opposition from the provinces and the oil and gas industry. And that's one thing that the federal government is considering seriously. Again, that opposition is quite tempered, and it's not the same level of opposition that we've seen for other climate measures. And the other side of that political balancing is the Prime Minister and the government in general is becoming more and more sensitive to the pushback that they are climbing down from their climate commitments. And a lot of that pushback is coming from within their own caucus. There's now a caucus, and a climate caucus within the Liberal Party that's made up of 50 to 60 MPs. I mean, in the time that I've been doing federal advocacy, which is many decades, I've never seen the level of environmental literacy within a governing party's caucus that I'm seeing today. I've never seen that level of they're mobilized, and they're working hard at this. And methane has been one of the big issues that group has been pushing on. So certainly we haven't. I'm not suggesting that the Carney government is going in all the right directions on this and responding to that pressure, but there is a counterbalance that we've seen over the last couple of months to that kind of rightward shift on environmental issues that we continue to see. As I mentioned before, there is some impetus within BC. BC does have the strongest provincial regulation, the only jurisdiction with that near zero target. There's also some balancing going on in BC, as anyone on the line knows who lives in that province, which is around LNG. There is a real tie-in to methane with the LNG fight. Global markets, especially Europe, are demanding gas imports be clean, and there is an actual import standard on methane that is coming into effect in 2030 for the EU, for Europe. So that really is, I think people are sensitive to that in BC. They're certainly sensitive to that in the federal government. There are markets in Asia that are also moving in that direction. So the notion that we want to develop our LNG sector has to be tempered a little bit, and methane is a key element of that. There is growing recognition that global markets for gas need to that there won't be much of a market for dirty oil, for dirty natural gas, and that has provided some impetus. It's not great for the climate for BC to be developing its LNG, especially at the pace that they're developing at, but there is at least some sensitivity that it's got to be low methane product, and BC's is generally a lot cleaner than other jurisdictions, but there's more willingness to make it cleaner through, for example, a near zero target than there is in other places, somewhat because they're already some partway there, and somewhat because they understand that global markets are demanding it. I think we've got one more slide. Oh, no, I guess, sorry, no, we don't. Yeah, so I'll pause there and looking forward to the discussion and any questions that folks may have.
Thanks, Erin, for that. And thank you to all the panelists for the information they presented. That was my first time watching the videos that Tim, or the footage from the optimal gas imaging camera that Tim took here in Alberta in June. And it is quite shocking to see that. But when we can see it, maybe that's the motivation that we can all do something about it. And so the call to action today is, there's many people on this call today, and I'm so grateful that you could attend. But now we need to do something about it. So we do. For Our Kids has a letter that that we will put into the chat that you can sign on. The letter goes to the ministers that Erin mentioned, Minister DeBrusen, Minister Hodgson, and Minister Michelle, who is our health minister, as well as to your MP. So please sign the letter at your convenience. And so next thing would be to make a call or two. So we're stepping up the ladder of engagement. And we do have a script that you can use. So For Our Kids has a methane page, website page. So we've put the links to the scripts. There's like a short script and one that's a bit longer. Personalize it when you make a call to your MP. You don't have to be an expert on this. Don't feel intimidated or don't feel like you have to know everything. You are a parent, you're a grandparent, you're a concerned citizen, and you want the government to do more about climate change, and you do not want this pollution going into our atmosphere. It can be very simple. So we've put the links or the information on the screen there. Your MP and Minister Hodgson would be, two calls that you could start with. And then if you wanted to make more calls, you could call Minister Julie DeBrusen and Minister Marjorie Michelle. Some people are wondering, does it make sense to call my Conservative MP? And the answer to that would be yes, of course. Call your Conservative MP and let them know that this is a concern of yours. And you can ask them to have the Conservative Party of Canada put methane into their climate plan. They might not have one, or it might not be in development, but let's put that on the radar of our Conservative MPs as well. Because we know that this work will continue. It won't just end with federal regulations. There will be work to do at the provincial level as well. A number of you have put questions into the chat. Thank you for your questions, but I'm just wondering if you could put them into the Q&A, and then we will address some of those questions now. We have a little bit more time, and so I'll just start with the first one. And this is coming from Glenn Gary. And the question is, what is the plan for permanent methane leak monitoring in Canada? And then the follow-up would be, how are excessive emissions regulated and punished effectively? And so who would like to take that question? Anyone of our panelists? Ari's got his hand up. Go for it, Ari.
I can give the first portion a shot around permanent monitoring. And so in the draft regulations, there's an option that allows companies the ability to use continuous monitoring systems. So they would set up a series of monitors around their facilities, and that would help to ensure that methane leaks are quickly identified. But I'm also thinking about satellites that different companies use and that we at one time had before it broke, that can more easily monitor emissions from space, and hopefully do a good job of alerting companies to those leaks when they happen. I'm not sure if that's the best answer, but that's what I've got. I think you're muted, Claire.
Whoops, sorry about that. This is a question from the Calgary Climate Hub. Thanks for being here. Does methane from an unlit flare get tallied in provincial emissions calculations, or do the models assume all flare stacks are lit? Does anyone want to take a stab at that one?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to take a stab at it, but there's this awkward silence, so I thought I'd try and fill it. So the current methane inventory, so the basis on which they are trying to figure out what our emissions are based on modeling. So they're not actually, unlike a lot of other pollutants, they're not based on what's actually going up a stack or out an effluent pipe. They're based on, they sort of take inputs and outputs into a facility and they model what the emissions are based on that. Virtually every peer-reviewed study that's done on this has shown that these are they wildly underreport emissions whenever they look at actual emissions versus modeled emissions, anywhere from 50 to 100% of a difference in terms of the actual emissions are anywhere from 50 to 100% higher. Canada's getting a little better at that than most other countries. They actually true up the modeling. They sort of complement the modeling now just in the last couple of years with actual emissions data. But something like the kinds of images that Tim's finding is not something that is factored into emissions, the emissions inventories that tell us how much emissions from methane are actually happening. So it's overall the emissions underreporting is less of a problem in Canada now than it was before. I can't remember the numbers, but I think they are. Somebody on the line could correct me maybe, but I think that they are kind of over 90% accurate, somewhere 90. I'm going to say 94%, but I might be wrong about that. Somewhere in that range. Whereas before they would have been, sort of down around sort of 50, 60, 70%. However, still not accurate and still not taking into account these emission sources that we find every single time we do flyovers, every single time we do the kind of modeling, the kind of monitoring that Tim's done recently. So there is, we are definitely dealing with incomplete information.
Aaron, I'll just add to that because I was doing some reading about this and also looking at some of these methane satellites that the one of the areas that's I think really underestimated is abandoned oil and gas wells. There's nobody who takes ownership for those. There's one study that I don't know how to share studies in the group. I can only share it to host some panels, but basically said that some of the oil and gas abandoned wells were up to 700% higher emissions, so 7 times the emissions that were estimated. And then the other one that's really worrisome to me, because I don't know how to fix it, is abandoned coal mines. If you actually look at the methane that's coming from the abandoned coal mines in the Crowsnest Pass area in particular, it's immense. And so, yeah, very tough to fix.
I'm just wondering, Ari, if you would be able to just address, Fiona in the chat has said there are several methane monitoring satellites, and I'm wondering if you could just touch on that.
Sure, that's right. There are you have Tropomi is one, which I believe takes of the widest picture of the Earth. GHGSat is another one, which is a Montreal-based company. I think they have 12 satellites. And I believe they look more at like regional or more narrowly focused. MethaneSat, which we had looked at the basin level, and I believe there's another one, Carbon Mapper, or perhaps I'm not sure if they're satellites or just aerial, but I know they tend to look very specifically at like more specific sites. Also probably worth noting that like outside of satellites, you also have a bunch of companies, Bridger Photonics being probably the most prominent of them, that use airplanes to do flyovers. And yeah, and I feel like it's an emerging field.
Thanks, Ari. I have a question for Tim. This is, how were sites selected for imaging? Was it based on known high emission sites? This is from Jenny. She says, I would love to see a comparison between these facilities and Imperial's refinery in East Edmonton.
So in the 2022 project, they were chosen by data that was publicly available for the higher emission sites. So nonprofits help with that process, David Suzuki Foundation, EDF, etc. And so, and then when I went and did the sites in 2022, I did those sites and any other potential sites along the way. And so it's hard to really describe for y'all that haven't been out in the oil field and seen how many sites there are out there. So it was just literally a drop in the bucket of what we saw in 2022. And then when we went back on this particular project, there were a few handful of sites that were pre-picked out before we left based on complaints or people's, if it was near a populated area and that kind of thing. And then we did a lot of follow-up on the same sites that we went to in 2022 to see if they were still emitting in the same fields. And like I think I stated earlier, what we really focused on was around the Lloydminster area in both years, both on the Alberta side and the Saskatchewan side. We just based ourselves out of Lloydminster and went in, all 4 quadrant directions in 2022 and did a little bit less in 2025. And then we spent some, I don't know, 3 days or so around Kindersley in Saskatchewan. So, and then kind of what y'all saw on the videos, by and large, and I did a lot of stuff, but by and large in the Alberta, generally speaking, it's storage tanks. There are some vertical flares, but they have more vapor combustors where the flames are like inside. Sometimes we call them combustors or burn boxes. And then a lot of sheds, kind of like I showed on those videos. And then Kindersley is much the same, but there seems to be a higher pressure in the area because the leaks can come out under high pressure. And then they have a lot more vertical flares, taller 100-foot or so flare stacks, of which that unlit flare that y'all saw in that video wasn't really the exception to the rule, because I probably saw 10 or 15 or so. I mean, there was only, you just can't imagine. There's only just a limit of time as to what can be recorded. All right. You can look around in all different directions. And if there's production going on, you're going to see emissions, right? I don't know that I saw any site that I thought had a total vapor recovery system on there. Everything is putting out. I don't mean every single source, but almost every single active site. If there's hydrocarbon being extracted, or if it's sitting in the storage tanks, there's volatilization going on. So, and in the wintertime, y'all storage tanks are painted black and spray foamed on the outside. And so you can keep the heat inside of them in the wintertime, so they keep viscous enough to keep moving and don't freeze. And then a lot of your storage tanks are heated in the wintertime in order to keep it volatile enough. And by just adding heat to the hydrocarbon, you're automatically having a volatilization going on. And even though I was there in the summertime, some of the stacks on storage tanks appear to be heated to me, so likely their heaters are still on. Anyway.
Thanks, Tim.
Sure.
We have another question in the chat. How much is the output of a flare regulated, scrubbers, etc.? And i.e. can and are the health impacts be mitigated? So kind of another technical question.
You know,
Yeah, I
unlike a
can't.
coal-fired power plant, which actually has to have some kind of removal system for, like coal-fired power plants have to remove mercury from the system to a certain degree, as well as you know, sulfur dioxide. There's the venting itself is just releasing gas into the atmosphere. There's no control over that at all, and I believe the same is for flaring. They just take the gas and light it on fire. There's no emissions mitigation ability there.
Yeah, typically in the US, I can't speak for Canadian regulations, but in the US side, there's limited flare testing or combustor testing that goes on with the manufacturers. And so they put through known gas at known flow rates and look at their flares and determine through testing about what they propose their combustion efficiency is. Okay, whether the device is, you know, capable of combust at whatever, 99%, 98%, whatever. And then in the US, on the regulation side, those are the assumptions that are made in the permitting process, that your flare control device is going to combust at whatever that is, 98%. And then, at least on the US side, there's instruments out there that have been manufactured since the OGI cameras are around, that with proper technical inputs from companies or being made to put them in there, like a Providence Photonic Mantis instrument can look at combustion efficiency and smoke index and all that kind of stuff, but you need technical inputs. So like environmental groups wouldn't have the technical inputs, but companies could, or regulators could, etc. And so if flares are not lit and the combustion efficiency, if they're not properly maintained, you know, flares can be burned too hot and they could be misshapen at the top of it because it kind of melts the flare tips. The engineering can be wrong. The flow rates can be either too low or too high, and they don't have the proper residence, waste streams in the combustion zone, etc. So all those things can play havoc on what the actual combustion efficiency is in the real world, whether it's that anticipated 98% in my example, or whether it's something much lower.
And Tim, if I can dumb it down a little bit for those people who don't really fully understand, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but if you fully combust a hydrocarbon chemical, it goes to H2O and CO2, and that's it, right? Like all this carbon turns into CO2, all the H turns into H2O, and any inefficiencies in that flaring releases chemicals that weren't burnt, or changes the chemical structure so that it's not you know, CO2 or H2O. And some of that is black soot. So if you're seeing a lot of black smoke coming out, that's inefficient. But there's other chemicals too that are released through that inefficient process. So ideally, you want very efficient burning. Am I getting that right, Tim?
You're getting it right fundamentally, right? You have a combustion process, and if you have H2S in your stream, that may convert to sulfur dioxide, so to speak. Other compounds may have formation of formaldehyde or oxides of nitrogen and all that kind of stuff. And obviously, there's some conversions into carbon dioxide. But I'll just tell y'all, because I've done a lot of like assessments around LNG facilities in the US, right? And I'm just saying it's a heated process. LNG, natural gas comes in, it goes through a pre-treatment process, and they try to get the impurities out. And then once the impurities out, it goes to the liquefaction, and they're trying to get it cold and condense it for shipping, so to speak. Okay, I said a lot there. But where I was going with is within that pre-treatment process, primarily the emissions are methane. Okay. And so I can see it in LNG, unheated, huge emissions being expelled by LNG facilities, not small emissions. I mean, ginormous emissions that dominate the landscape downwind of these LNG plants. And so, although I think there's some carbon dioxide there, my camera doesn't detect carbon dioxide. There's different carbon dioxide cameras with different filters. So what I'm detecting primarily is still methane. So I guess I'm telling you, even with pre-treatment process and being heated and being combusted, that conversion from methane to a different compound is not 100% efficient.
Thanks, Tim. We do have just a couple minutes left. So I think what we will do is just take one more question, and then the questions that we were not able to get to, we will try and answer them and send those out in a follow-up email. And so the question is from Tina, and it is, are you expecting there will be federal subsidies to reduce methane by 75%? What advocacy is happening to ensure polluters are paying to reduce their methane emissions and not the federal government with public dollars?
I can take a whack at that. That's a great question. And certainly when the first reg was passed, the federal government also created a fund for reducing methane. Now, the intent was for the methane emissions from that fund, that resulted from that fund, to be over and above what the target was. So the intent was industry would pay to reach the target, and then if they want to go further, they could draw on this fund to do that. What the environmental commissioner found was that wasn't the case, that we were actually subsidizing for compliance, which is exactly the problem that I think you're getting at, Tina. So the federal government hasn't this time around talked about setting up a fund like that, but certainly it's probably something we want to be on the lookout for. If they do, there's a whole debate about whether we want to subsidize the reduction of methane at all, because it is a fossil fuel subsidy. But if the federal government is going to put that kind of a subsidy in place, it can't be for compliance. It has to be for over and above that.
Thanks, Aaron. And we are almost at time, so I am going to leave the rest of the questions. I really do appreciate that there are so many questions. And as I mentioned, we will do our very best to answer them and get an email out to you in short order with also with the recording of this webinar. I would like to thank the panelists for being here. It was very interesting for me to listen. I feel like I've learned a lot over the past year, but I'm always learning new things. So thank you for being here. And I want to thank all the folks behind the scenes at CAPE, and also for our kids who've helped to put this webinar on. And I want to thank you, the audience, who have spent your evening with us. So take care, everyone. And if you haven't yet, please sign our letter and make some calls. That would be really appreciated.